He was eventually posted to the Columbia Barracks at Fort Vancouver in Washington Territory as quartermaster, really a store clerk in uniform. And despite the beauties of the countryside, he grew gloomier and lonelier as the months wore on, and as one unsuccessful commercial venture followed another. Even Julia's letters began to express a certain impatience with Ulysses, as she waited in Sackett's Harbor with her two sons, Fred and Ulysses Jr., called Buck by everybody but his mother, the younger of whom Grant had not so far seen. It was there, in full view of Mount Hood and the Pacific, that the stories of Grant's drinking began. Let it be said, first of all, that Grant was never a convivial drunk. He did not haunt bar rooms and exchange boozy anecdotes with fellow drinkers. Loneliness, depression, a sense of failure, and the inability to see any improvement in his condition led Grant to drink. He went on solitary binges, alone in his room with a bottle of whiskey. In later life, once he was a rising general, it became the object of his faithful staff to prevent this from happening, and to conceal it when they failed to prevent it. Drinking did not make Grant cheerful. Indeed, his hangovers were made more acute both by his tendency toward migraine headaches, which was exacerbated by alcohol, and by his shame at his own weakness in taking to the bottle. To some degree, fame and a sense of purpose overcame Grant's drinking problem after 1861, and the presence of Mrs. Grant usually appears to have kept him from the bottle. He was not a man who could withstand his own failure or Julia's absence. It was as simple as that. At Fort Vancouver, however, he could not escape his own failure. He had no sense of purpose, and Julia was 1,500 impassable miles away, so he drank. Whether he drank as much as or less than people said hardly matters. Transferred eventually to Fort Humboldt in Northern California, he was lonelier still. He did not even have a horse of his own to ride, and his drinking soon came to the attention of his commanding officer. Ordered to give it up, he tried hard. Then he went back to drinking, and finally, in the spring of 1854, he took the drastic step of writing a letter resigning from the army, either under pressure from his commander or out of despair, ironically receiving by letter his promotion to captain on the same day. The captaincy had come too late to make a difference to Grant. His only thought was to get home, explain himself to Julia, and never leave her side again. With at last a purpose in mind, Grant set off as fast as he could, borrowing money for the journey from his West Point classmate Simon Bolivar Buckner. Grant was a civilian again for the first time since the day he had arrived at West Point. Whatever Julia's thoughts about the matter, Jesse was determined to set matters right. He, better than anyone, knew how unfit Ulysses was for anything other than soldiering, and was appalled at his son's throwing away his career, however modest it might be. Jesse wrote at once to his congressman, not the unlucky Hamer this time, to request that the Secretary of War reinstate his son Ulysses as a captain, and when that failed to have any effect, followed it up with a letter of his own. The Secretary of War wrote back a rather snubbing letter pointing out that it was too late, that his decision on the matter was irrevocable, and suggesting between the lines that there were matters Captain Grant would probably prefer not to face publicly. Perhaps a reference to rumors of his drinking on duty, perhaps to the missing $1,000. The Secretary of War at the time was, of all people, Jefferson Davis, future President of the Confederacy, and the one man, apart from General Hancock, whom Ulysses Grant in later life would treat as a personal enemy. Hancock, Grant forgave as he lay dying. Davis, who had snubbed Grant's father, refused to reinstate Grant in the Army, and then gone on and betrayed his own country to lead the Confederacy, Grant could never forgive. Good deal of correspondence and unnecessary travel back and forth between New York City and Sackett's Harbor, Grant finally rejoined Julia in St. Louis, a failure at the early age of 32, with no trade beyond the one he had just resigned. Since no help was forthcoming from Jesse, who did not disguise his feeling that Ulysses had thrown away a perfectly good position, or feel like supporting not only Ulysses but Julia and their two children, with a third already on the way, Grant was obliged to throw himself on the mercy of his father-in-law and took over some of his brother-in-law's farmland in Kentucky. With his own hands, Grant built a house, which he called, with some accuracy, and perhaps a degree of irony, hard scrabble. Till the soil and put in a crop. Julia adapted to this life of primitive yeoman farming, the kind of thing Jefferson had dreamed of as the backbone of the infant republic, but from which everybody who tried it was eager to escape. But she did not pretend to like it. She called the house crude, as indeed it was, and does not seem to have had much confidence in Ulysses' ability to survive as a farmer, even with the help of the Dent family slaves. She would soon be proved correct. The presence of the slaves may have taught Grant something about the notorious inefficiency of slave labor. After all, hard work gained the slave nothing, but it did not save the farm. Still, the Grant survived nearly 2 years of back-breaking labor, poor returns, and mounting debt, while she bore him 2 more children, a girl, Nellie, and another boy, Jesse, named after Ulysses' father, a sentimental gesture that failed to soften the old man's heart. Once again, it was not for lack of hard work that Grant failed as a farmer. It was the business of farming that defeated him. He could do anything that was needed on the farm, it appeared, except make a profit out of it.
Structure sold.
To some degree, that was not his fault. Manifest destiny had increased the power of Wall Street and the world of high finance and railway building over that of Jeffersonian yeomen, small farmers, and pioneers. The time had come to pay the piper for the enormous increase in America's size, many times larger than what had been acquired by the Louisiana Purchase, and requiring huge amounts of capital for what we would now call development, in a nation with a largely unregulated banking system. As a result, bank crises and a sharp decline in agricultural prices ruined many small farmers shrewder than Grant. While he had been planting his crops and building hardscrabble, the consequences of the annexation of Texas and victory over Mexico had been coming home to roost. The United States was now a continental nation, but the question of slavery still divided it. Mrs. Grant might gush over the loyalty and affection to her person of the Dent family slaves, but the burning question of whether slavery could be extended to the new territories of the West still perplexed and infuriated Americans. Slavery was no longer a debating issue, but a fighting one. In the North, abolitionists took the gloves off. Mrs. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, the book that caused Queen Victoria to cry, that made Simon Legree the symbol of Southern oppression, and that would eventually cause Lincoln to say to its author on meeting her, "So you're the little lady who started this war." The North reacted with outrage to the U.S. Supreme Court's decision, in the Dred Scott case, that a slave was merely property who could be hunted down and returned to his owner, even from the North. On the floor of the U.S. Senate, distinguished senators slashed at each other with canes, and members of both houses took to carrying Colonel Samuel Colt's new pocket revolver. And in the Kansas Territory, bleeding Kansas, the question of whether slavery could be, would be, extended farther west was beginning to be played out in blood, not just ink. It is against this background of rising tension and anger that Ulysses Grant's failure as a farmer must be seen. Like the rest of the nation, he was waiting, appalled and impotent, for the storm to break. He could not have predicted the swift and dreadful chain of events, the spiraling outbreak of murder and lawlessness between abolitionist and pro-slavery factions in Kansas, culminating in the fearful outrage enacted by the followers of John Brown and his sons on the hapless slave-owning farmers at Pottawatomie Creek, whom Brown dragged from their beds and executed with a broadsword. The fearful plunge towards civil war that had been set in motion by the victories that Grant had helped to win. Still it was there, like a thunderstorm building over the plains, distant but threatening, and only the deaf failed to hear the ominous rumbling. These events did not, of course, take place at once, but sputtered like a burning fuse over nearly a decade of increasing acrimony and sporadic, often gleeful, butchery on the part of fanatics on both sides, as a war of words hardened into the prospect of a real war, perhaps the only profession for which Captain Grant, failed farmer and small entrepreneur, was properly trained. All over the country, the state militias drilled, mostly clumsy country bumpkins, clueless, armed, if at all, with weapons that went back to the War of 1812. guided, if they were lucky, by some old textbook on infantry drill in the hands of one of their elected officers, and by a firm belief in the national myth of the Minutemen at Concord and Lexington, the amateur soldiers who had left their homes and farms, hunting rifles in hand, to confront the Redcoats. In the meantime, Grant, having failed at farming, was forced to undergo the ultimate humiliation. In the summer of 1860, he was obliged to turn back to his father, tail between his legs, and ask for help. Jesse's terms were harsh and not negotiable. The Grants could come back and live in Galena, Illinois, and Ulysses would work as a clerk in Jesse's harness and leather shop there, under the supervision of his younger brothers, Orville and Simpson. Like many other writers, F. Scott Fitzgerald in The Great Gatsby speculated on Grant lolling in his general store in Galena as the prototype of the seemingly ordinary American waiting patiently to be called to a high destiny. But it cannot have appeared so to Grant or anybody else in Galena. His salary was small and grudgingly paid. He and his family lived in a tiny house, which Julia could have compared with Whitehaven only with great dissatisfaction. An Irish maid was no substitute for a bevy of slave house servants, and Grant's total lack of any of those qualities that make for a good salesman was only too obvious to both his brothers and the customers. Even those in Galena who did not think he was a secret drinker, and they were few, could hardly fail to notice his dull, vacant expression, his shuffling gait, his threadbare clothes, and his total lack of interest in the leather and harness business. Burdened with debts, stuck at last in his father's leather business, which he had always sought to avoid, with no prospects and not even a horse to ride, he waited. For what? In the leather shop, the customers talked about the news and politics, and Grant listened silently, tying packages with twine and perhaps making the occasional sale. He had no gift for small talk, and he kept his opinions to himself. But we know from his memoirs what those opinions were. He had opposed the Mexican War. He was against the expansion of slavery. He thought President James Buchanan was a weakling, and he was moving from being a Democrat to becoming a Lincoln Republican. Above all, he recognized what few other people had thought through yet. If the southern states seceded from the Union, there would be war. If there was war, one result would eventually be the destruction of slavery. And that war, if and when it came, would be incalculably more bloody than anyone supposed, and would be won only by brute force and killing on a scale that would eclipse all previous wars. The election of Abraham Lincoln set in motion the events that were to bring Ulysses S. Grant out from behind the counter of the harness shop for good. On April 15th, the news of the firing on Fort Sumter reached Galena, and a mass meeting was called by local congressman Elihu B. Washburn, a Galena man, at which Grant was present. 2 days later, another meeting was held to discuss the recruitment of troops. As the only man in town who was a graduate of West Point, Grant was asked to chair the meeting and did so. In his own words, "I never went into our leather store after that meeting to put up a package or do other business." Grant's star had not yet risen, but it was about to, and would carry him away from Galena and into such fame as few men have experienced. For once, he moved with a sure step. He went, still in his shabby civilian clothes and at his own expense, with a company of Galena volunteers to Springfield, where they were to be mustered, and declined to advance himself for the captaincy on the grounds that as a former officer of the regular army he was entitled to something better. A stroke of cunning and realism that was new to Grant, but may simply have been the instinctive understanding of how the army works coming back to him, a West Pointer and regular officer, as if he had never taken off the uniform. For weeks, Grant was in limbo, a civilian in a volunteer army that was slowly being put into uniform, with no rank or position. Looking at his Galena volunteers, he might have agreed with the Duke of Wellington's comment on the first sight of his troops in the peninsula. "I do not know what effect they will have on the enemy, sir, but by God, they frighten me." He lobbied his old senior officers of the Mexican War days with no result. He paid 2 calls on Major General George B. McClellan, whom he had known at West Point, and was twice ignored, left waiting and rebuffed. He begged Jesse to intercede for him and seek an appointment for him as a colonel, Then finally, almost by accident, Grant himself hit upon the right lever to pull and went back to Galena to seek the support of Representative Washburn, who saw in Grant something nobody else had seen, except Julia. A rare degree of determination, real experience of war, and perhaps most important to Washburn, the fact that here was a fellow Galena man, somebody who would be grateful to the politician who gave him a push. Grant returned to Springfield, and on June 17th, in his own matter-of-fact way, he was able to write home that he had been appointed a colonel. The war was about to begin in earnest.
Construction complete.
Chapter 5. Grant may have been a colonel, but he still had no uniform or horse. Opportunity had knocked before he was kitted out for it. The officers of the 21st Illinois Volunteers, which had been formed at Mattoon, had complained bitterly to the governor that their commanding officer was incompetent and drunk. And when it was clear that they meant business, and were probably correct, the governor suggested Colonel Grant to replace him. Grant arrived to take command of his regiment in wrinkled civilian clothes and a battered hat, and found them ragged and barefoot themselves, as well as undisciplined. The uncertainty and sense of failure that had haunted him as a civilian seemed to drop away from him instantly. Men who were insolent to officers he had tied to posts and, when necessary, gagged. Foul language he punished severely. Saluting he insisted upon. Very shortly, the 21st became a model regiment, except for Grant himself, who still had no uniform, military equipment, or horse. His father, Jesse, and his brothers were not prepared to put up another penny toward Ulysses' military career, while his father-in-law now considered him a traitor to the Southern cause and made it clear that while there would always be a place at his table for Julia, there would henceforth be none for Ulysses. Ironically, Colonel Dent would end up living in the White House as a kind of permanent house guest once Grant became president, surprising people with his staunchly Confederate views. Eventually, a Galena merchant took pity on Grant and loaned him enough money for his uniform and equipment, and Grant took the 21st to war. Grant marched his regiment into Missouri in search of rebels, particularly a certain Colonel Thomas Harris, whose Confederate troops were plaguing local farmers and who was said to be a fiery and aggressive commander. Grant located Harris's camp and advanced on it, writing years later that, as he led his men over the brow of a hill, I would have given anything to be back in Illinois, but I had not the moral courage to halt. He soon discovered that Harris and his men had already fled, and wrote, "It occurred to me at once that Harris was much afraid of me as I had been of him. This was a view of the question that I had never taken before, but it was one I never forgot afterwards." Henceforth, Grant would always operate on the assumption that the enemy had as much reason to be afraid of him as he might be of the enemy, and from that event to the end of the war, I never experienced trepidation upon confronting an enemy. Grant's memoirs are pellucid and reveal not only a striking literary gift, but an amazing memory. Still, his modesty is such that he has to be read carefully. He is not writing here about fear or physical courage. He had already demonstrated his fearlessness in Mexico to his own satisfaction. He is writing here about what amounts to stage fright as a commander of men in battle. He had learned a lot by observing Zachary Taylor in Mexico. But as every young officer discovers in battle, it is one thing to give an order, and quite another to know it will be obeyed. Here, in the unpromising countryside of Missouri, he had braced himself to order his men into battle, led them over the brow of the hill, and found, to his relief and theirs, that the enemy had fled. It was his first step as a commander, the realization that he knew what he was doing and that his men would follow him, that Grant was describing here. Exactly like that of Napoleon at the bridge of Arcola, when the young Napoleon, who was as personally fearless as Grant, also realized for the first time that men would follow him. It may be, too, that Grant at last realized his own strengths. He was not a thinker, like the unfortunate General McClellan, who thought so long and hard about a campaign that it never got anywhere, leading Lincoln to complain that McClellan had a case of the slows, and exasperating the president until he finally asked if he could borrow the Army of the Potomac since McClellan wasn't using it. Grant, on the at him, not thought. He would try something, and if it failed, he would try something else. But his instinct was always to keep moving forward against the enemy. Napoleon, when asked what his method was of beginning a battle, replied, "On s'engage et puis on voit." Much as Grant, according to his memoirs, disliked Napoleon, his view of battle was the same. He attacked the enemy, and then he waited to see what happened. One senses in the words of Grant about his anticlimactic attack on Harris a dawning understanding that he had found, at last, something he could do better than other men. He was courageous, he had common sense, he could read a map, and like the child he had been, he would never go backward and retrace his steps once he had started out. In an army full of commanders busily planning how to win a war without fighting a battle, Grant sought one out. The elements of military genius were all there, hardened and annealed by the experience of Mexico and the years of failure. Now, at last, he had the opportunity to use them. While Grant marched his men up and down the dusty Missouri roads in pursuit of Harris, larger events were taking place in Springfield and Washington, D.C. President Lincoln was anxious to create enough brigadier generals to command the rapidly growing volunteer army, and Representative Washburn, a fellow Illinois politician, convinced the president that at least one of these new generals should come from his own district. Lincoln, who never forgot the rule that all politics are local, allowed Washburn to name his pick. Since Grant was the only Galena man appointed a colonel, Washburn put his name down for promotion to the rank of brigadier general. And by the time Grant returned from the fruitless chase after Harris, he read in the newspaper that he was now Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant. Only a few months ago, he had been ex-Captain Sam Grant, slouching behind the counter of his father's store, wrapping packages. Now he wore the single gold star of a brigadier general on his shoulders, and, surrounded by his staff, rode into Cairo, Illinois, to set up his headquarters at the Cairo Hotel, which no less an authority than W.H. Russell, the famous war correspondent of the London Times, would describe as a hellhole of heat, vermin, and flies. Russell's interest in Cairo, Illinois, like Grant's, is a point worth noting. At this early stage of the Civil War, the belief on both sides was that one big battle would bring the other side to its senses. If nothing else, the First Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas as it is known in the South, would shortly prove that this assumption was doubtful. Fought within sight of Washington, D.C., in what are now its suburbs, Bull Run was a devastating defeat for the North. Although crowds of civilians had come out by carriage to see the battle, as if it were a parade, Brigadier General Irvin McDowell's army was badly mauled by the army of Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard. McDowell lost nearly 3,000 men and 27 cannon, as most of his troops broke and ran. A determined pursuit might have won Beauregard Washington, but the victorious Confederates were as exhausted as their defeated opponents. Three things emerged from the disaster that would affect the future course of the war. One was the first appearance on the battlefield of Confederate Brigadier General Thomas J. Jackson, one of the great generals of the war, who earned his nickname Stonewall at Bull Run when General Barnard E. Bee rallied his troops by shouting, "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall." The second was the belief, in the North and in the South, that the war would be won, must be won, in the narrow territory that separated Washington from Richmond. And the third was the very slowly dawning realization that neither side would give way after one big battle, and that many more might have to be fought. Grant and W.H. Russell, who had seen war at its best and at its worst in the Crimea, where he had personally witnessed the charge of the Light Brigade from a position next to Lord Raglan himself, understood almost at once that the key to winning the war was in the West, not in the East, in front of Washington. He saw that the Confederacy's weakness was its size, not its industrial inferiority to the North. The Confederacy was vast, and there was no way it could be defended with equal strength all along its frontier. Yet this was exactly what Jefferson Davis proposed to do. Davis wanted a big victory, big enough to shock Lincoln to the bargaining table for a treaty of peace. and to convince the European powers that the Confederacy was there to stay. But he also didn't want to surrender an inch of territory for fear of what that might do to Southern morale. Though something of a bookworm at West Point and afterward, Davis seemed to have forgotten that old military maxim, to attempt to be strong everywhere is to be strong nowhere. Seen from drab, dusty Cairo, the heart of the South lay open to a determined thrust, aimed down the great rivers that separated the Confederacy into two separate regions. A determined advance through the border states of Missouri and Kentucky would bring a federal army within reach of Tennessee and Mississippi, and such a thrust could be supplied by river rather than overland. Victory would split the Confederacy, expose its vast, weakly defended western border to attack at any point, and allow a Union army to threaten the southern heartland, opening up a war of movement instead of big, set-piece battles. Grant might not have spent much time on books about strategy at West Point, but he could read a map, which is more than could be said for many of his colleagues. From Cairo, he could see how to win the war, as plain as a pikestaff. Russell saw it too, hence his interest in Cairo. And more important, 1,000 miles to the east, Abraham Lincoln saw it, felt it in his bones. For after all, he was an Illinois man who had traveled up and down the great rivers in his youth. He sensed uneasily that McDowell had been wrong, that even General Scott was wrong, and that McClellan would be wrong too when his turn came, and looked to the West for a general who understood what was in the back of his mind. A whole different kind of war. For the moment, no such person seemed to exist. Grant's immediate superior was the flamboyant Major General John C. Fremont, the Pathfinder, as he was called, after his supposed explorations in the West. A political and celebrity general, an amateur, whose personal fortune, glamorous wife, and undisguised presidential ambitions did not inspire much confidence in Lincoln. Fremont was too busy talking to reporters to pay much attention to Grant, whom he scarcely knew, and thus was unable to prevent Grant from taking his forces 40 miles above Cairo to seize the town of Paducah, Kentucky, before the Confederates got there. Paducah was not of itself much of a prize, but a look at the map shows that the Tennessee and the Cumberland rivers both flow into the Ohio near Paducah. A Union army could descend the two rivers deep into the heart of Tennessee. The Confederates could read a map too, and they had already built two strong forts, Fort Henry to protect the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson to protect the Cumberland, and manned them with sizable forces. It now occurred to them that occupying Paducah would strengthen their position, but the force they sent to take it retired when they found Grant already holding it. Not a shot had been fired, but Grant had opened the way south just a crack and calmed the good citizens of Paducah with a respectful and sensible proclamation, appealing to their better instincts. "I have come among you," he wrote, "not as an enemy, but as your friend and fellow citizen." And when Lincoln saw it, he is reported to have said, "The man who can write like that is fitted to command in the West." Grant's soothing proclamation was followed by a more rousing one from Fremont, threatening, among other things, to seize the slaves and property of Confederate sympathizers and shoot any man not in uniform found bearing a gun. These were exactly the kind of sentiments most calculated to turn inhabitants of the border states away from the Union cause at just the moment when Lincoln was trying to woo them, and when Fremont high-handedly refused to withdraw his proclamation at the president's request, he was removed from his command, his presidential aspirations as good as gone. Grant was no longer in Fremont's shadow, and his name was beginning to be known, at least in the White House. Lincoln may not have said, when told about Grant's drinking, "Tell me the brand of whiskey that Grant drinks. I would like to send a barrel of it to every one of my other generals." But he did say to one of Grant's many critics, "I cannot spare this man. He fights." Would shortly prove that he could not only fight, but move fast. In the meantime, with the collapse of Fremont's balloon, Grant found himself under the command of Major General Henry W. Halleck, commander of the Department of Missouri. Up until then, Halleck's chief concern had not been the Confederates, but the more important task of getting rid of Fremont and maintaining his superiority in numbers over his. Grant now moved into Halleck's field of vision as a new threat. Halleck was known to his fellow Army officers as Old Brains, and he didn't like or trust a single thing he had heard about Grant. Cautious, pop-eyed, bald, quick to criticize, and slow to make up his mind, a desk-bound general who was something of an intriguer and a gossip, many of the stories about Grant's drinking can be traced back to him, Halleck was to become, for a time, Grant's bête noire. Though once Grant finally succeeded, he would find Halleck a useful man to look after things in Washington, while Grant took to the field. Halleck's strengths, attention to detail, administrative ability, a love of paperwork, and an intimate knowledge of the Army way of doing things, in many ways complemented Grant's. The second person who entered Grant's life at this point and made an immediate difference was John A. Rawlins, who joined Grant's staff as an aide. Grant did not know Rawlins well. For some time he wrote his name as Rawlins. But Rawlins was a fellow Galena man and had, in fact, been the attorney for Jesse Grant's leather and harness shop. Rawlins took charge of Grant's chaotic paperwork, for which Grant had no gift at all. He also acted, from the beginning, as Grant's éminence bleue, advisor, protector, sounding board. Rawlins was abrasive, exacting, even abusive, had no difficulty, unlike Grant, in saying no to people, and was above all a fervent and outspoken teetotaler who abstained from all forms of spirits. Rawlins was a born follower who had been looking all his life for a man to follow, and found him in Grant. It became his role to prevent Grant from reaching for the bottle, and on those occasions when he failed, to keep Grant out of sight. Rawlins was like a faithful guard dog, ferocious, absolutely loyal to his master, and devoted to protecting him, even from himself. With Rawlins to guard his flank, Grant took to the field immediately. Ordered by Halleck to make a demonstration at Belmont, a Confederate camp on the Mississippi 20 miles below Cairo, opposite Columbus, Missouri, that is, to impress and overawe the Confederates there by his presence, Grant went beyond his orders. He took 3,000 men downriver by steamer and decided to attack Belmont instead. He landed, drove the Confederates out of the fortified camp, then was sharply driven back himself when they counterattacked in superior numbers. Grant had stirred up a hornet's nest and was very likely to get his troops embarked again. Grant was the last man to leave, riding his horse straight down a steep, almost perpendicular bank under enemy fire, then across a narrow plank onto the deck of the waiting steamer, another brilliant feat of horsemanship that would have been performed by a stuntman in a movie. No sooner was Grant in his cabin than a bullet came through the hull, hitting the pillow on which he was about to lay his head. He must have begun to sense in himself a certain destiny, but also, as he began to suspect at Belmont, and perhaps even in Mexico, a gift for command. Risks did not seem to scare him. He hardly even noticed danger. Quietly but firmly, he got things done. Halleck bristled at Grant's transformation of a demonstration into an amphibious landing against a larger force. But Grant, with a newly acquired sense of public relations, or perhaps on Rawlins' shrewd advice, decided to call it a raid. If it had been an attack, then he had been repulsed, as the Confederates claimed, whereas if it was a raid, it had been daring and successful. Halleck grumbled, was not fooled for a moment, but accepted Grant's explanation, though it did nothing to increase his confidence in Grant. Nevertheless, after considerable acrimonious correspondence between Halleck and Grant, and a few suggestions leaked from Halleck to Washington that Grant might have been drunk, Halleck reluctantly agreed to let his impetuous subordinate attack Fort Henry, the weaker of the two Confederate forts that guarded the Tennessee and the Cumberland rivers, surely hoping to upstage General Buell and, perhaps wrongly, assuming that this would keep Grant occupied for some time. Buell had 45,000 men in his command, just south of Louisville, Kentucky, and had been promising to advance on Nashville for some time. Halleck, with 91,000 men and an eye fixed firmly on Washington, wanted very much to carry out an attack before Buell did. Buell's forces were spread out, and he was in no hurry to move them, and Halleck must have thought there could be no harm in dispatching Grant to do a little mischief in the general direction of Nashville before Buell did. Grant did not hesitate. He moved, like Rommel nearly 80 years later, mit blitzartiger Schnelle, the lightning speed so favored by German panzer generals, and took the Confederates by surprise. Grant was carried south on the Tennessee River by a flotilla of transports and gunboats under the command of Commander Andrew H. Foote, USN, which had originally been assembled to carry Buell south and was still waiting for Buell to move. Having preempted Buell's flotilla, Grant now deftly stepped into the limelight before Buell. He was about to receive help from an unexpected source, his Confederate opponents. Despite his dislike of Napoleon, Grant was about to prove the Emperor right again. When asked what kind of generals he liked best, Napoleon is said to have replied, "Lucky ones." Luck was about to strike Grant at last. Though the Confederacy had recognized the importance of the rivers flowing north into the Ohio before the Union generals did, its choice of positions for the forts defending them was hampered by a reluctance to advance too far north into Kentucky, and the Confederate fortress system was therefore built at unpromising points. Perhaps Jefferson Davis and General A.S. Johnston had also dozed during the lectures on fortifications at West Point, or neglected to read Vauban's classic work on the subject. But in any case, Fort Henry, on the Tennessee River, was placed on low ground so that it could be shelled by gunboats. The Confederates then made the classic mistake of attempting to strengthen it by building a supporting fort, Fort Hyman, on the opposite west bank of the Tennessee, which was on higher ground but only lightly manned. Had they paid more attention at West Point to reading Vauban, Louis XIV's builder of fortifications, they would have realized the folly of trying to reinforce a poor position with a weak one. But Grant saw the opportunity at once. He landed Brigadier General Charles F. Smith, a crusty, competent, scientific soldier who by coincidence had been Grant's chief instructor at West Point, on the west bank of the Tennessee about 2 miles north of Fort Hyman, and the Confederate commander immediately abandoned it. That left Fort Henry exposed to fire from Foote's gunboats and to an overland enveloping attack carried out swiftly by Grant. So Fort Henry, too, was abandoned, its 25,000-man garrison marching on 2 dirt tracks over muddy, rugged country to join the Confederate forces at Fort Donelson on the west bank of the Cumberland. Grant took the opportunity of sending Smith, who seemed to relish having escaped from his teaching position at West Point into real warfare, to destroy the Memphis and Ohio Railroad Bridge over the Tennessee, in effect stranding the Confederates, then moved his forces through cold, wet weather and thick mud in 2 columns to invest Fort Donelson. He had taken Fort Hyman on February 4th. He took Fort Henry on the 6th, and he had surrounded nearly 20,000 Confederate troops in Fort Donelson by the 14th. By the night of February 15th, 16th, Grant's left wing, under Smith, pierced the elaborate Confederate defenses, and Confederate Generals John Floyd and Gideon Pillow fled, abandoning command to the hapless Buckner, who surrendered to Grant on the 16th after their famous exchange of correspondence. Thus, in 12 days, Grant had opened up the way into Tennessee, captured the largest number of Confederate prisoners and guns since the war began — it was, in fact, the largest surrender in the history of North America to date — and achieved the first major Union victory of the war. Grant's troops were now only 70 miles from Nashville, and within a few days, as the news traveled north by telegraph, he would be proclaimed a national hero by the press and promoted to Major General of Volunteers. Because he smoked cigars when he could afford them, admiring citizens sent him cigars by the box, a tidal wave of tobacco that would continue to the end of his life. He became, like Freud and Winston Churchill in a later age, a chain smoker of cigars, seldom photographed without one. In the end, like Freud, he would die of his addiction from cancer of the jaw and throat. But in 1862, that was far in the future.